Yeah, so I will share sort of the moment that I first thought COVID was going to affect my life or really pose a challenge to my life. And in telling bits and pieces of this story to family and friends, I've come to think of it as a three-act play. And I'm going to start with sort of the second act because I think it's the most visceral before I give more context. But just to preface, one thing I've noticed about my experience with the pandemic, and especially with quarantine, is that time seems much different now than it did before. So days and weeks and even months seem to run into one another. And my guess is that some of the disorientation people might be experiencing around time, and definitely that I've experienced, has contributed to heightened feelings in some cases of anxiety. So all of this said, I'm not quite sure when exactly I had the moment I'm going to describe, but I think it was sometime about 6 weeks in. So at about the end of April, which for me and I know for you, Alan, coincided with the end of the winter term and all that entailed. And actually, just talking about this moment makes me a bit uncomfortable, but I guess that's kind of the point. So I had this moment sitting at my desk in my basement, as I am now, with piles of paper all around me and marking on my desktop and a spreadsheet on my laptop and emails on my iPad and my wife consoling my two daughters upstairs who were crying and toys all around me and my hands stinging from washing and hand sanitizing them so much and my fingernails bleeding from biting them so much and my mind racing thinking about the health of different people in my life, but also how if something bad happened to our place I wouldn't have anyone to help me, and then thinking that rain was going to seep into our basement and I should check our foundation, and thinking that something would happen to my family and we would be stranded in a medical emergency. And finally, noticing that I was counting every letter in the feedback I was writing to students, or else thinking I'd somehow be responsible for those students getting sick or for my family getting sick or for me getting sick, and then also feeling extreme guilt for thinking of my own health. I had this moment where I really felt as if the walls were closing in and the room was getting smaller, and I had this pressure on my chest and I was going to pass out. And for many years, I've had similar moments, though not always as acute or overwhelming. But it's only in recent years that I've learned to consider and recognize these moments as anxiety attacks. All of which brings me back to my first act, if you will. About 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder as well as social and generalized anxiety. And of course, as sociologists, we might discuss the social construction of some of these diagnoses, but I will say that I found that having an explanation or reasoning for what I've experienced really all throughout my life has given me a lot of hope. I've said this before, but this isn't so much I like to put my books in alphabetical order kind of stuff, but more like I get stuck in ritualistic loops for hours and need to sleep kind of stuff. And at times, my struggles have been debilitating, as in times I've locked myself in my room for days or demolished parts of my home looking for electrical problems or sat up all night watching my daughters sleep to make sure they're safe. So I came to this point where I was really tired and wanted to be in the best health for my family and myself, but especially because I knew we had a baby girl on the way and I wanted to give her the best life that I could. So all of this prompted me to finally reach out for support, including some pretty intense work doing CBT, or what's called cognitive behavioral therapy. And I tell this story not to be self-congratulatory or any way, but because I want to stress how common it is. And it's only in recent years that I've begun talking about this more, including with or in front of students, because I've seen so many students struggle with all kinds of different mental health issues. And because I can only imagine how difficult it must be for folks, especially folks without my privilege, to navigate any system, but especially maybe the mental health system. I wanted to give some context to the moment I first realized COVID was going to affect me, and to say that I don't know where I'd be now during the pandemic if I didn't do all of the work I did before the pandemic. So sort of the third act here is that I've started to think more about the mental health challenges I faced, because the struggle is real, and as they say, the stigma is real. And I do think, along with obviously public policy and funding, that awareness and discussion can go a long way with this issue. I'm sure this pandemic moment has highlighted for many how anxiety can affect our well being. And there's an interesting correlation, I think, between the excessive cleaning in which some folks might be engaged and the sort of stereotype of the person struggling with OCD who cleans endlessly and fears what we call contamination. There's a psychologist and professor at McMaster University, and I've read a lot of her work, Dr. Karen Roa, and she has talked about how she hopes the pandemic can actually help reduce the stigma against OCD. And I brought up one article from a news source that she was quoted in. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I just want to read a little bit. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So, Dr. Rowe talks about how many individuals who struggle with OCD often have these rituals or specific ways of completing a task, usually involving an excessive amount of cleanliness. But for some of these individuals, he says, who are suffering, they may have taken the recommendations for isolation and quarantine to an extreme. Their anxiety and OCD concerns may have pushed some of those rules where they feel like they don't even want to go out or touch anything. According to CAMH, 1 in 40 adult Canadians are diagnosed with OCD. And while the pandemic has definitely affected those living with OCD, Dr. Roa also talks about how some of her clients have found it to be slightly comforting to see others struggling in a way that people who have OCD always struggle. She says, I've had a number of my clients tell me they feel a small relief that other people in the general population now have to go through significant behaviors that they normally have to go through. In some ways, hopefully, this is reducing the stigma and helping people understand what it might feel like to have OCD or significant anxiety at times. So just to kind of put a bow on this, since the moment I described there being days when I thought I've got this, no problem, and days when it all seemed utterly impossible. But I've tried to take better care of myself, which has meant knowing my limits, trying to be more mindful of how I'm feeling, trying to practice open communication with my loved ones, and doing some of the exercises that are very difficult but helped me a lot when I was more involved in sort of recovering in the first place. So I just wanted to tell this story because I hope it helps others in some small way.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I really appreciate your honesty. I think it's part of the way that we provide a human community. And unfortunately, post-secondary learning is often uh, not, we often don't get the chances for that kind of human engagement with each other. Professors tend to present themselves often as just as knowledge, but not as people.
Right.
And so I really appreciate you sharing that.